If you have to convince yourself that today is perfect, it probably is not. I did not understand the meaning of that thought until my wedding day. Looking back now, the warning signs were everywhere. I just kept choosing not to see them. The morning began exactly the way I had always imagined. Sunlight poured through the large windows of the lakeside venue outside Madison, Wisconsin. White flowers lined the ceremony aisle. Soft music drifted through the reception hall while vendors rushed to finish the final details. Friends and family filled the property with laughter and excitement. After 2 years of planning, the day had finally arrived. In less than 3 hours, I was supposed to marry Ethan Parker. At 32 years old, I believed I was stepping into the happiest chapter of my life. I stood in the bridal suite looking at my reflection in the mirror. My dress fit perfectly. My hair was exactly how I wanted it. Every detail seemed right. Yet something felt wrong. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was small, quiet, easy to ignore. The kind of feeling people talk themselves out of when they do not want to ruin an important day. My maid of honor, Jessica, noticed it immediately. "You seem nervous," she said while adjusting a floral arrangement on a nearby table. I smiled. "Every bride is nervous." She laughed and nodded. "True, but you seem distracted." Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. A message from Ethan. I expected something sweet. Maybe a note about how excited he was to see me. Instead, it was a simple text. "Mom is upset again. Please just be patient with her today." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I locked the phone without replying. Jessica noticed my expression. "Patricia?" she asked. I nodded. She sighed. Neither of us needed further explanation. Patricia Parker had been a constant source of tension throughout our engagement. She had opinions about everything. The venue, the flowers, the guest list, the menu, the music, even my wedding dress. At first, I told myself she was simply excited. Then I convinced myself she was struggling to let go of her role in Ethan's life. Eventually, I stopped looking for explanations. Altogether, the truth was simple. Patricia always wanted control. The harder truth was that Ethan almost always gave it to her. Around noon, I stepped outside for a few minutes to clear my head. The venue overlooked a beautiful lake surrounded by pine trees and rolling hills. The water sparkled beneath the autumn sun. Guests were beginning to arrive. Everything looked like a scene from a magazine. Then I saw her. Patricia stood near the side entrance of the reception area wearing an expensive cream-colored suit. She was speaking with several relatives. In one hand, she held a cigarette. A cloud of smoke drifted toward the outdoor seating area where staff members were preparing food and decorations. I stopped walking. Something about the sight bothered me more than it should have. It was not just the cigarette. It was the expression on her face. Calm, defiant, as if the wedding belonged to her. And in that moment, standing there beneath a perfect blue sky, I suddenly wondered whether I had spent the last 2 years preparing for a marriage or competing for a place in someone else's family. I stood there for several seconds watching Patricia as guests continued arriving around her. Nobody seemed willing to say anything. A few relatives noticed the cigarette. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply pretended not to see it. That had always been Patricia's advantage. People adjusted themselves around her instead of asking her to adjust for anyone else. I turned and walked back toward the bridal suite, telling myself not to let it ruin the day. Yet the image stayed with me. By the time I reached the building, I was no longer thinking about the cigarette. I was thinking about the last 2 years. Looking back, the pattern seemed obvious. Patricia had inserted herself into nearly every major decision Ethan and I made. When we chose our apartment, she insisted we move closer to her neighborhood. When we planned holidays, she expected Ethan to prioritize her traditions over ours. When we discussed our future, she always seemed to have an opinion before I had finished expressing mine. The frustrating part was not Patricia herself. It was Ethan. Every time I raised a concern, he found a reason to excuse her behavior. She means well. She is just protective. That is how she shows love. Eventually, I stopped arguing. Not because I agreed. Because I was tired. Love has a strange way of making people negotiate with their own instincts. Around 1 o'clock, the bridal suite became crowded with makeup artists, bridesmaids, photographers, and relatives. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone except me. Jessica noticed immediately. "You are thinking about her again," she said quietly while helping arrange my veil. I laughed softly. Am I that obvious? Only to someone who has heard every story. I smiled but said nothing. She was right. Jessica had been there through every difficult conversation, every canceled dinner, every awkward family gathering, every moment when Patricia managed to make herself the center of attention. A few minutes later, another text arrived from Ethan. This one was even shorter. Please do not start anything today. I stared at the screen. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I had not spoken to Patricia. I had not complained. I had not created a problem. Yet somehow I was already being treated like the person responsible for keeping the peace. Again, the realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Outside the window, guests continued filling the ceremony area. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The florist delivered the final arrangements. Staff members prepared tables for the reception. Everything looked beautiful. Everything looked perfect. Yet beneath the surface, something felt increasingly fragile. About 40 minutes before the ceremony, I stepped outside again, hoping the fresh air would clear my thoughts. As I walked along the stone pathway leading toward the reception tent, I saw Patricia once more. She stood near the dining area speaking with several guests. The cigarette was back in her hand. Smoke drifted directly toward freshly prepared linens and floral displays. For a moment, I simply watched. Then I made a decision. I was not angry. I was not trying to embarrass her. I only wanted to protect the wedding we had spent 2 years planning. Taking a deep breath, I started walking toward her, completely unaware that the next few minutes would change the entire course of my future. As I approached Patricia, I reminded myself to stay calm. This was not a confrontation. It was a simple request. The reception area had taken months to design. Fresh flowers covered nearly every table. White fabric draped across the outdoor tent. Food stations were being prepared only a few yards away. I assumed any reasonable person would understand my concern. Patricia noticed me before I reached her. She smiled politely for the benefit of the relatives standing nearby, but there was something cold behind it. The same expression I had seen countless times before. "Lauren," she said, "you look lovely." "Thank you," I replied. "Can I speak with you for a second?" The relatives stepped back slightly, giving us privacy without actually leaving. Patricia folded her arms and waited. I took a breath. "Would you mind using the designated smoking area for the rest of the afternoon?" I asked. "The venue has one near the parking lot. I am worried about the smoke around the reception setup." For a moment, she simply stared at me. I expected annoyance, maybe a brief argument. Instead, her expression changed completely. It was as if I had insulted her in front of everyone. "Are you serious?" she asked. I blinked. "I'm not trying to upset you. I just thought. You thought this was the appropriate time to lecture me." Her voice had grown louder. Several nearby guests turned toward us. I immediately regretted approaching her in public. "That is not what I am doing," I said carefully. "I am only asking because the venue requested it." Patricia laughed. Not a pleasant laugh. The kind meant to embarrass someone. "Interesting," she said, "because nobody else seems bothered." I glanced around. A few people quickly looked away. Nobody wanted to get involved. The familiar pattern was unfolding again. Patricia created tension. Everyone else disappeared. "I am not trying to create a problem," I said. "I only want a day to go smoothly." "Then perhaps you should stop creating problems," she replied. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel. Because they sounded so familiar. For years, every concern I raised somehow became evidence that I was difficult. If Patricia criticized something, people called her passionate. If I expressed discomfort, people called me sensitive. Before I could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "What is going on?" My stomach tightened immediately. Ethan had arrived. He walked toward us wearing his tuxedo, looking concerned and slightly irritated. Patricia answered before I had the chance. "Your bride thinks I am ruining the wedding." I stared at her in disbelief. That was not remotely close to what I had said. Ethan looked at me. "Lauren." His tone already carried frustration. I asked if she could use the designated smoking area. I explained. That is all. For a second, nobody spoke. The wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the lake. Guests continued arriving in the distance. The ceremony was less than 30 minutes away. Everything about the scene should have felt joyful. Instead, I suddenly felt very alone. Ethan looked from me to his mother and back again. And in that moment, I realized his next words mattered far more than the cigarette ever had. The few seconds that followed felt much longer. I looked at Ethan and waited. Not because I needed him to agree with me. Not because I wanted him to choose sides. I simply wanted him to be fair. Patricia stood beside him with her arms folded, looking completely confident. She already seemed certain about what would happen next. Ethan sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Lauren," he said, "could you please let this go for today?" The words hit me harder than I expected. "Let it go," I repeated. I asked her to use the smoking area the venue provided. "It is not a big deal," he replied. "Then why has it become one?" I asked quietly. Neither of them answered immediately. Around us, several guests pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. The uncomfortable tension continued spreading through the reception area. Patricia shook her head dramatically. "I came here to celebrate my son's wedding," she said. "I did not come here to be treated like a child." I stared at her. The conversation had become completely disconnected from reality. Nobody had treated her like a child. Nobody had insulted her. Yet somehow she had transformed a simple request into a personal attack. Ethan immediately turned toward his mother. "Nobody is treating you badly," he assured her. Then he looked back at me. "Lauren, please. Not today." There it was again. "Not today." As if I were the problem. As if I were creating conflict instead of responding to it. A strange calm began replacing my frustration. Sometimes clarity arrives quietly. Sometimes it appears in a single moment that changes everything. Standing there in my wedding dress, I suddenly stopped focusing on Patricia altogether. For years I had viewed her as the obstacle between Ethan and me. But what if she was not the real problem? What if the real problem was the man standing beside her? Patricia could only dominate every situation because Ethan allowed it. Patricia could only ignore boundaries because Ethan protected her from consequences. Patricia could only make herself the center of our relationship because Ethan repeatedly handed her that position. The realization settled heavily inside me. Ethan stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was exactly what he always said whenever I expressed discomfort. Every concern became an overreaction. Every boundary became an inconvenience. Every compromise somehow flowed in one direction. Jessica suddenly appeared near the edge of the group. She had probably noticed the growing tension from across the venue. Her eyes met mine briefly. I could tell she understood something was wrong. Very wrong. Guests continued arriving for the ceremony. Music floated across the property. Staff members adjusted floral arrangements. Everything looked beautiful from a distance. Yet standing there beside Ethan, I felt further away from him than I ever had before. Then Patricia spoke again. "Honestly, Ethan, if this is how she behaves before the ceremony, I cannot imagine what marriage will be like." Several nearby guests froze. The comment was deliberate, public, humiliating. I waited for Ethan to defend me. I waited for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he remained silent. And in that silence, I finally received the answer I had been looking for all along. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The conversation seemed suspended in place while guests continued arriving around us. I looked at Ethan and realized I was no longer waiting for him to defend me. That hope had quietly disappeared. Patricia's comment still hung in the air, and his silence had given it more power than any response ever could. Jessica stepped closer to my side. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The concern on her face said enough. Ethan finally exhaled and shook his head. "Can we please stop this?" he asked. "The ceremony starts soon." I stared at him. "That is what you are worried about?" I asked quietly. "The ceremony?" He looked frustrated. "Lauren, everyone is here. We have spent months planning this day." "Exactly," I replied. "Months." My voice remained calm, but inside something had shifted permanently. I was no longer thinking about the reception tent or the flowers or the seating chart. I was thinking about the future, about anniversaries, holidays, decisions, children, every major moment that might come after today. And suddenly I could see the pattern extending years ahead. Every disagreement would become my responsibility to manage. Every boundary would become negotiable if Patricia disliked it. Every conflict would end exactly the same way. Ethan standing in the middle while somehow protecting only one side. Patricia rolled her eyes dramatically. "I cannot believe we are still discussing this." I turned toward her. "Neither can I." She looked surprised by my response. Perhaps because I was not emotional. Perhaps because I was not apologizing. For the first time all afternoon, I felt completely clear. A venue manager approached cautiously and informed everyone that guests were beginning to take their seats. The ceremony was scheduled to start in less than 15 minutes. Around us, people began moving toward the lakefront ceremony area. The tension remained, but now it felt impossible to ignore. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks before quietly walking away. Even they seemed to understand something larger than a simple disagreement had just happened. Ethan stepped closer. "Can we talk privately?" he asked. I nodded. We walked a short distance toward a pathway overlooking the water. The sounds of wedding preparations drifted across the property. It should have felt romantic. Instead, it felt like standing at a crossroads. "You are letting this ruin everything," Ethan said. I stared at the lake. "Am I?" He looked confused. "Of course you are." I slowly turned toward him. "Do you honestly believe this is about smoking?" For the first time, he had no immediate answer. His silence confirmed what I already knew. Deep down, he understood it too. This had never been about a cigarette. It was about respect. It was about priorities. It was about whether the person standing beside me viewed me as his future partner or simply another person expected to accommodate his mother. The realization settled between us. Heavy, unavoidable. In the distance, music began playing as guests found their seats. The ceremony was only moments away. Yet standing there beside the lake, looking at the man I was supposed to marry, I felt less certain than I had ever felt in my entire life. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The lake reflected the afternoon sunlight while guests settled into their seats across the ceremony lawn. From a distance, everything still looked like a wedding. Up close, it felt like a turning point. Ethan looked exhausted, frustrated, confused. Yet what struck me most was that he still seemed unable to understand why I was standing there questioning everything. "Lauren," he said finally, "you are acting like this is some kind of test." I looked at him carefully. "Maybe it is." He frowned. "A test of what?" The answer came more easily than I expected. "A test of whether we are actually ready to build a life together." His expression hardened. "That is not fair." I nodded slowly. "You are right. It is not fair. It has not been fair for a long time." The words surprised even me. For years I had avoided conversations like this because I wanted peace. I wanted harmony. I wanted to believe love would eventually solve problems that honesty was supposed to solve first. But standing there, dressed for a ceremony that was supposed to unite two families, I suddenly realized how much of myself I had spent protecting everyone else's comfort. Ethan glanced toward the ceremony area where guests were waiting. "People are expecting us." I followed his gaze. Rows of white chairs stretched across the lawn. Friends had traveled from different states to attend. Relatives filled the front rows. Months of planning surrounded us. Yet for the first time all day, none of that felt important. "I know they are," I said quietly. "But they are expecting a marriage, not just a wedding." Ethan looked away. The silence between us grew heavier. Then something unexpected happened. Several guests began approaching from the reception area. Not to interrupt, not to pressure us. They simply looked concerned. Jessica was among them. So was Ethan's cousin Rachel, someone who had always been close to both of us. Their expressions told me everything. People had noticed. More than that, people understood. The tension was no longer hidden. Patricia remained near the reception tent speaking with relatives, but the confidence she displayed earlier seemed different now. Several people who had been standing with her had quietly drifted away. Others appeared uncomfortable. For the first time all afternoon, the story she wanted everyone to believe was no longer the only story being told. Rachel approached Ethan gently. "Maybe you should listen to her," she said. The comment was simple, but Ethan looked stunned. Jessica nodded. "She is not asking for much." Neither woman sounded angry. They sounded honest. And honesty has a way of changing a room. Ethan glanced around and seemed to realize something important. People were not automatically agreeing with him. They were not automatically agreeing with his mother. They were seeing the situation for themselves. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Standing there beneath the autumn sun, I felt something inside me settle into place. I was no longer afraid of disappointing people. I was no longer worried about ruining a wedding day. For the first time, I was asking a different question entirely. If this was how we handled a small boundary before the ceremony even began, what would the rest of our future look like once the celebration ended? Something changed after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for everyone to feel it. The certainty that had surrounded Patricia for years began to fade. People were no longer looking at her as the unquestioned authority in the situation. They were looking at the entire picture. And the more they looked, the harder it became to ignore what had actually happened. Jessica remained beside me while Ethan stood quietly a few feet away. Rachel crossed her arms and glanced toward the reception area, where Patricia continued speaking with a group of relatives. The problem for Patricia was that the audience was getting smaller. Guests who had heard portions of the disagreement were now comparing notes. They had seen me approach respectfully. They had seen Patricia escalate the conversation. They had seen Ethan repeatedly dismiss my concerns. Nobody needed an explanation anymore. They had watched it unfold themselves. A wedding coordinator approached cautiously and asked if we needed additional time before the ceremony. Her expression was professional, but I could see concern in her eyes. Even the staff could sense that something important was happening. Ethan looked embarrassed. "Everything is fine," he said automatically. The words sounded hollow. For the first time all day, nobody immediately accepted them. The coordinator nodded politely and walked away. Jessica looked at Ethan. "No, it is not." Her voice remained calm. "And pretending it is fine will not make it fine." Ethan stared at the ground. I could see the conflict in his face. Part of him wanted the day to continue exactly as planned. Another part was beginning to recognize that the problem could not be solved by simply asking me to stay quiet. Across the property, Patricia finally noticed that people were no longer gathering around her. She started walking toward us. Her confident expression returned, but now it felt forced. As she approached, several relatives quietly stepped aside instead of following her. The shift was subtle, yet impossible to miss. "Are we really still doing this?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. That silence said more than any argument could have. Patricia looked around, apparently expecting support. Instead, she found uncertainty. Rachel spoke first. "I think Lauren asked a reasonable question." Patricia looked stunned. "Excuse me." Rachel did not back down. "The venue has a smoking area. That seems pretty normal." Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time that afternoon, nobody rushed to defend her. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. I could practically see years of family habits colliding with reality inside his head. The dynamic he had relied on for so long was no longer working. People were making their own judgments. The more they did, the more isolated Patricia seemed to become. Yet the strangest part was that I did not feel triumphant. I felt relieved. Relieved that I was no longer the only person seeing the problem. Relieved that the truth no longer depended on my ability to explain it. The truth was standing in front of everyone. The ceremony music began again in the distance. Guests were seated. The lake sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Everything was ready. Everything except the future I had imagined. And as I looked at Ethan standing between me and his mother, I realized karma was not some dramatic event waiting to happen. It was this moment. The moment when people finally saw the consequences of choices that had been ignored for years. The realization settled over me with surprising calm. For hours I had been trying to save a wedding. Now I understood I needed to make a decision about a marriage. Those were not the same thing. The ceremony music continued drifting across the lake as guests waited in their seats. The photographer stood near the aisle looking uncertain. Staff members exchanged quiet glances. The entire event seemed frozen between what had been planned and what was about to happen. Ethan finally stepped toward me. "Lauren, we can fix this," he said. His voice sounded desperate now. Earlier, he had been frustrated. Earlier, he had wanted me to stay quiet. Now he seemed afraid. I looked at him carefully. "Can we?" I asked. He nodded quickly. "Of course we can." For a moment, I almost wished I believed him. It would have been easier. Easier to walk down the aisle. Easier to smile for photographs. Easier to pretend the future would somehow be different from the present. But deep down, I knew better. Nothing had happened that day by accident. Nobody had revealed a new personality. Nobody had suddenly changed. What happened was that the truth became impossible to ignore. Patricia stepped forward. "This has gone far enough," she said. Her voice carried the same authority she had always used. The difference was that it no longer affected me. "You are embarrassing everyone," she continued. I shook my head gently. No, the embarrassment started long before today. The words surprised even me. They were not angry. They were simply honest. Ethan looked exhausted. "Please do not do this." I felt sadness hearing that. Not because I was uncertain, because I remembered how much I once loved him. I remembered the first dates, the road trips, the plans we made late at night, the future we imagined together. None of those memories were false. They were real. But so was this moment. and this moment revealed something the memories could not erase. Jessica stepped beside me again. Her presence felt grounding, familiar, supportive. She did not tell me what to do. She trusted me to decide for myself. That trust meant more than she probably realized. I looked around the venue one final time. The flowers were beautiful. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Families filled the ceremony chairs. It was everything I had wanted. Yet suddenly I understood that wanting something is not the same as choosing it. I turned back to Ethan. "I cannot walk down that aisle today," I said softly. His face fell. Several people nearby lowered their eyes. Nobody looked shocked. In fact, many looked relieved, as if they had reached the same conclusion minutes earlier but could not say it themselves. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed to understand that this was not a negotiation. It was a decision. A difficult one. A heartbreaking one. But a necessary one. The wind moved gently across the water. The music faded. Guests waited quietly. And standing there in my wedding dress beneath a perfect autumn sky, I finally chose myself. For a few moments, nobody moved. The reality of what had just happened seemed to settle over the entire venue at once. The rows of white chairs remained filled with guests, but the anticipation that had defined the day was gone. In its place was something quieter. Understanding. I stood there looking across the lake, feeling the weight of my decision and the unexpected peace that came with it. Ethan remained silent. His shoulders slumped slightly as though he was finally seeing the situation through a different lens. Patricia looked stunned. For years, she had controlled the direction of every conversation. This time, there was nothing left to argue about. The choice had already been made. Jessica gently placed a hand on my arm. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I took a slow breath and nodded. Surprisingly, I was. Heartbroken, yes. Disappointed, absolutely. But beneath those emotions was relief. The kind of relief that comes when you stop fighting against the truth. Around us, guests began standing and quietly speaking among themselves. Many offered kind smiles as they passed. Some approached to express support. Others simply nodded with understanding. Nobody treated me like a failure. Nobody treated me like I had ruined the day. In fact, several people told me the same thing. They admired my courage. That word stayed with me because I had not felt courageous. I had felt scared. I had felt uncertain. Yet sometimes courage is simply choosing not to ignore what you already know. As the afternoon continued, the wedding slowly transformed into something else. The venue staff handled everything with remarkable professionalism. Family members gathered in small groups. Friends surrounded me with warmth and encouragement. The atmosphere became less about disappointment and more about honesty. Meanwhile, Ethan spent much of the afternoon speaking quietly with relatives. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed genuinely reflective. I did not hate him. I did not even feel angry anymore. I simply understood that love alone is not enough when respect and partnership are missing. Months later, I would hear through mutual friends that Ethan had finally begun setting healthier boundaries in his life. Whether that was true or not, I hope it was. Sometimes karma is not punishment. Sometimes karma is clarity. It forces people to face realities they have avoided for years. As the sun began setting over the lake, I changed out of my wedding dress and stood alone for a moment near the water's edge. The sky glowed with shades of gold and orange. The same view that had looked so perfect that morning now felt meaningful in a completely different way. I thought about the future. Not the future I had planned, but the future I still had. A future built on self-respect rather than compromise. A future where my voice mattered. A future where I would never again confuse keeping the peace with giving away my place in my own life. I watched the sunlight fade across the water and smiled softly. I had arrived expecting to begin a marriage. Instead, I left with something far more valuable. The certainty that choosing yourself is never a mistake when the alternative is losing who you are.